Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the absolute foundational figures of American literature. I'm talking about James Fenimore Cooper's legendary character, Natty Bumppo. If you really want to understand the American psyche, especially how the nation historically viewed the frontier, the environment, and indigenous peoples, you absolutely have to look at this guy. His complex cultural identity didn't just, entertain 19th century readers, it quite literally shaped the cultural mythology of a growing nation. So let's get right into it. I want you to consider this for a second. Who was America's very first superhero? I mean, long before we had comic books packed with caped crusaders, early 19th century readers were completely obsessed with this intrepid frontier scout. We're talking about a character who possessed near superhuman marksmanship, an unparalleled knowledge of the wilderness, and this stoic moral compass guiding him through the brutal conflicts of early America. He was the ultimate woodsman, and honestly, he took the reading world by storm. This character is the star of a massive 5-book series of historical novels known as the Leatherstocking Tales, written by James Fenimore Cooper between 1823 and 1841. Now, if you've heard of him, it's probably from the most famous of these books, The Last of the Mohicans. It's this romantic masterpiece set against the incredibly fierce backdrop of the French and Indian War in 1757. Cooper's stories were an absolute sensation. They were essentially the summer blockbuster action epics of their day. They give Americans this thrilling sense of their own history and introduce European readers to the wild, untamed landscapes of the New World. Okay, let's dive into this. Look at the many names this hero goes by. Born Natty Bumppo, he's known as Hawkeye to his friends, Leatherstocking to the settlers, the Deerslayer in his youth, and La Longue Carabine, or the Long Rifle, to his French enemies. The guy is a total legend, and he's incredibly multifaceted. Every single group he interacts with sees him slightly differently. And that perfectly sets up the central conflict of his character, right? He kind of belongs to everyone, and yet he belongs to no one. Section 1. Caught between two worlds. And this brilliantly illustrates how Natty Bumppo is the quintessential man caught between two worlds. He represents this profound colonial hybridity. So on one hand, you have his white European background. The original texts tell us he was educated in a church school. He frequently leans on what he calls his Christian gifts, and he's super quick to assert that he is a man with absolutely no Indian blood. But then, on the other hand, look at how he actually lives. He moves way more comfortably in the deep forest than in any colonial town. He totally rejects the trappings of European civilization, lives perpetually with indigenous tribes like the Delaware, and strictly follows their rules of survival. He is, for sure, a walking contradiction. Section 2. The cultural hybrid. Navigating this hybrid identity on a really violent frontier means he's constantly doing this intense internal negotiation of morals and loyalties. This quote from the Deerslayer hits the nail on the head. Picture this. Natty is facing an unarmed enemy in a canoe and he has the absolute perfect shot. But he lowers his rifle. He mutters to himself that taking the shot might be redskin warfare, but it's not a Christian gift. He literally gives his enemy time to reload. He uses this idea of Christian gifts over and over to justify his moral choices in battle. It's like he's constantly trying to reconcile the ruthless necessities of surviving in the wilderness with his strict European religious upbringing. Now, because he is this unique hybrid, Hawkeye serves as a totally crucial link between the white settlers and the native tribes. But what's really fascinating here is that Cooper entirely excludes him from, well, actually scratch that. It's more like Cooper intentionally keeps him out of the traditional romantic love plots of these novels. Instead, Hawkeye channels all his deep human connection into these highly idealized friendships with indigenous characters, specifically the Mohican chief, Chingachgook, and his son, Uncas. For Uncas, Hawkeye becomes this incredibly powerful, symbolic father figure. Together, they represent this idealized, interracial brotherhood that acts as the absolute moral center of Cooper's stories. Section 3. Defender of the Wilderness. Now, what's really interesting about this is another layer to Natty Bumppo entirely. His relationship with a rapidly changing American landscape. Just look at this quote from the Pioneers. Use, but do not waste. That highlights a surprisingly early 19th century American preoccupation with environmental conservation and resource management. Long before we had modern environmentalism, Cooper's novels were already exploring the deep tension between the pristine, primitive beauty of the forests and the destructive axes of the incoming American settlers. We clearly see a juxtaposition here of Natty's deep respect for nature against the wasteful greed of the encroaching white civilization. I mean, Natty practices extreme frugality. He takes only what is needed. If it's a holiday meal, he just needs a small bird. In stark contrast, you've got settlers like Judge Temple and Billy Kirby who operate with just shocking extravagance and negligence. They're out there killing 5 deer just for a single feast, or chopping down entire swaths of trees on a hillside, basically just to assert their dominance over the land. To Natty, this kind of greed comes from a heart that just fundamentally lacks love for the environment. And because of all this relentless destruction, Bumpo is continually driven westward. The irresistible pressure of American expansion, what a lot of folks back then called the advance of civilization, is something Natty just cannot stomach. As the series moves into his old age in novels like The Prairie, we see him retreating deeper and deeper into the plains. He's desperately trying to escape the laws and the frankly devastating environmental habits of the new settlers. His constant movement is essentially a silent, lifelong protest against the loss of the virgin American wilderness. Section 4. The Myth of Erasure. Let's move on and see how this builds, because we have to pivot here from the romance of literature to the really harsh realities of history. When we put Cooper's fantasy side by side with historical reality, we see a very specific narrative being constructed. Cooper basically took traits from the Mohican, Mohican, and Delaware tribes and threw them into a blender to create this generic pan-Indian fantasy, totally flattening out their distinct, complex cultures. In these books, Native characters rarely get to just be complex human beings. They're either elevated as pure moral symbols or demonized as villains to teach the reader a lesson. And most significantly, Cooper presented the Mohican tribe as completely doomed to extinction. But in reality, the Mohican nation was absolutely not extinct. Their communities survived, they adapted, and they lived full, complex lives. So the crucial takeaway here is that the tragic death of Uncas in the novel reinforced what became known as the vanishing Indian myth. This was a hugely pervasive 19th century narrative that falsely framed Indigenous survival as unnatural, or just flat out impossible. It planted this insidious idea that Native peoples were just naturally fading away to make room for progress. By popularizing this concept, the novel actually provided a very convenient, romanticized justification for the very real, horrific dispossession happening on the ground, like President Andrew Jackson's violent removal policies in the 1830s. Section 5. America's Frontier Legacy. So, what does this all mean for us today? We really have to ask ourselves, why did America need a hero like Hawkeye? Why did this very specific, culturally conflicted character resonate so deeply with a nation that was rapidly industrializing, expanding its borders, and violently displacing the original inhabitants of the land? Well, the answer is that precisely because of his complex cultural identity, Natty Bumppo acts as the ultimate American wish fulfillment. He is a vessel for a massive cultural guilt complex. Think about it for a second. Hawkeye is a white man who intimately understands, loves, and deeply respects the indigenous cultures and the wilderness that are actively being destroyed. He mourns for them. But at the end of the day, he is still a white man who represents the inevitable progress of the very civilization he's trying to outrun. Through him, the reader gets to feel sympathetic and sad about the loss of the frontier, while simultaneously accepting that loss as just a necessary step for American progress. When we read The Last of the Mohicans and the rest of the Leatherstocking Tales critically today, it totally exposes the cultural machinery of early America. These books aren't really about Native people as they actually were. Not at all. They are a reflection of how 19th century America wanted to imagine Native people as noble, tragic, incredibly brave, but most importantly, safely disappearing. It reveals a nation deeply, deeply conflicted about its own expansion, trying desperately to forge a brand new identity out of the very wilderness it was destroying. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to ponder. The ghosts of Cooper's frontier legacy didn't just pack up and stay in the 19th century. How do the vanishing Indian myth and the archetype of the rugged white savior still echo in the movies, television shows, and literature that we consume today? Seriously, once you see the blueprint that Natty Bumppo created, you are going to start noticing it absolutely everywhere. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope it changes the way you look at the myth of the American frontier.